Hello, welcome to the Introduction to Neurobiology. This is the first lecture in the course, actually more like the 0th lecture, because it introduces the course as a whole. I will describe what the course is about, what is it that we are trying to answer, what is the main question that we are trying to answer here. And then we'll talk a little bit about neurons, about neural cells, and we'll finish with a really brief overview of the course. So let's start with the main question. Let's start from here. We are made of cells. You're aware of that, right? All living things on Earth are made of cells. And each cell does something. Each cell is alive. In some sense, it has a nucleus with DNA, and it uses proteins and so on and so forth. And these cells are combined together to make up our bodies. Right? All right. It's okay. It's interesting, it's weird, but we can live with it, right? It doesn't present an existential problem. Yeah, we're made of cells. Like, okay, let's see here. So these are blood cells, and each blood cell is red so it makes blood red. And the blood carries oxygen around, and indeed each blood cell carries a little bit of oxygen around. So cells do what blood does. Right? Or like, look at these are skin cells, and skin cells are flat, and each skin cell covers a little bit of an area, so altogether they cover a lot of the area and they made up skin. So again, same pattern, each cell does a little part in the big task that this tissue does. And same is true for liver cells, for example. So what does the liver do? Among other things, it filters toxins out of your blood, and each liver cell, they're called hepatocytes, yeah, it does a little bit of that. It catches a little bit of toxins from the blood and breaks them apart. And even for organs that are maybe harder to imagine that they're made of cells, but like muscles, for example, each muscle cell is long in the same way as like muscles are kind of elongated, and each of them generates a little bit of force and contracts a little bit. And so when you combine lots of them, you have a tissue, you have an organ that generates lots of force and contracts a lot. Right? And again, neither of these facts presents a problem. I mean, we can believe that an organ that does something consists of tiny elements that do little parts of this something. But at this point, you probably already see where I'm going, because we have one organ that's pretty special. It's called the brain. And the special thing about it is that everything that you think, everything that you feel, all your hopes, all your fears, all your, like everything that makes you human is somehow sitting inside this organ, is somehow generated by this organ. And, this statement may sound a little bit extreme to you if, for example, like some people believe in things like soul, which are a little bit more abstract concepts. But even if you are hesitant to agree that everything that you are is in the brain, just let's think of some examples. For example, people say gut feeling, like I have a gut feeling that I shouldn't go to this abandoned hospital at midnight. But it's not really a gut feeling, if you think about that, right? It's not like your intestines or your stomach are talking to you like, don't go. Full moon is a bad time to go to an abandoned hospital. It's not really your intestines speaking. It's somewhere in your head, some part of your brain that just operates in a slightly different way, and people call it intuition. Sometimes that's another way to call this same thing. So it just tries to guess what makes sense and what doesn't, and then you feel that. It's not your gut, it's your brain. Or like broken heart, when somebody went through, some love trauma, and now they're sad and they don't want to party and they sit in a corner and play an ukulele. It's not really that the heart is not working. The heart is still pumping blood, all right. But all the neurochemistry, all the chemistry in their brain is kind of goes awry because, they're feeling this intense emotion. And you know that it's not the heart, right? Or muscle memory. People speak about muscle memory sometimes, like when you're playing learning to play a musical instrument or playing some sports, but actually it's not in the muscle. The muscle can become stronger, can become weaker, but muscles don't learn sequences of actions. But in our brain, in the motor cortex, we have cells, we have circuits that learn sequences of actions, and this is called muscle memory. So brain is special. Here's another example, actually. Here's another example. Let's think about a person losing some part of their body. If a person loses their leg, well, it's still the same person, just now they have to use the prosthetics, right? But who they are doesn't change. Or in an extreme case, a case of heart transplant, if somebody's heart doesn't work and then somebody else dies and in a motor crash maybe, and so a person gets a heart transplant, it's still the same person, just with a new heart, and now they have to take certain pills in order to make it work. But if brain transplant existed, and it doesn't exist, and right now we cannot do that, and there was like a hoax, almost kind of news that somebody's trying to do a head transplant, but it's not really possible right now. But if head transplant existed, it wouldn't be like, Mary getting a new head. It would be Julie getting a new body. Does that make sense? Because brain, at the very least, contributes the most of what we are. Our consciousness, our intellect, our feelings, our emotions, our memories are all somehow are sitting there. But as any other part of the body, brain is made of cells. It's made of these tiny cells. And that's where we have this problem, and I think it's a philosophical problem as well, but definitely a practical problem also. How is it possible? Because in all other examples, when we looked at a cellular structure, each cell did a little part of a big job. But in this case, how is it possible? How can you reduce something seemingly as irreducible as you? How can you create this from interactions of these tiny units? Like, what are they? Are they magic? Do they come equipped with like a little bit of free will and a little bit of consciousness? How does it work? You know what I mean? That's weird if you think about that. And it's almost impossible to believe philosophically, but also practically. If we can answer this question, it can help us a lot. It can help us. We will be able to help humans who have some sort of an issue. Maybe they have a genetic problem and something doesn't work in their neural tissue, or maybe they are old and some type of cells in the brain is dying. So knowing how to create a functioning human brain, a functioning human mind from cells would help us. But also it would help us in things like artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence can be pretty handy, and it can help us with environmental problems on this planet, for example. We can talk later about that. But you can guess that if we know how to create a human mind from cells, then we'll probably be able to create other minds as well. And we don't seem to know it right now, and it feels impossible, but we also know that actually it is possible because, you're listening to these presentations right now, you're perceiving and thinking about and analyzing and memorizing, like processing this presentation right now with your brain that's made of tiny little cells. And that's the biggest question of this course, and that's what we'll be trying to answer in this course, to the extent to which we can do it at the current level of knowledge and in one course only. All right? So that's an aspiration. That's a big promise. But we'll try. And let's start with looking at brain, like at one brain cell. So let's started looking at one neuron. Brain cells are called neurons. I mean, there are different kinds of cells in the brain, but this is the main one. And let's start with thinking, what's special about this cell? So this is a picture, a drawing of one cell from the brain, from the part in the back called the cerebellum, but it doesn't matter for the time, for the moment. So what's special about it? What do you think? Well, I bet you noticed that it has a funny shape. It's pretty, right? Actually, like this cell is called a Purkinje cell, or Americans sometimes call it Purkinje because it's from a Czech word, and Anyways, this is a pretty cell, and I think that's probably the most common cell to be printed on mugs and T-shirts because it's pretty. So why? Why does it have this shape? Why do neural cells have this shape? What do you think? Like, think for a second. What could be the answer? I think you probably have an idea. It's clearly reaching for something, right? So what can it be that it's reaching for with these tree-like, root-like structures? Probably not literally water like with roots or light as with branches. So probably it's not about food. It's reaching for information. It's reaching for connections, right? A cell like that with this shape can make lots of connections with other cells. If a cell is round and blobby, how many connections can it have? About a dozen, right? So if you have identical round cells and they're packed like that, it has like 6 connections in one plane and then 3 on top and 3 on the bottom. So it's 12 connections total. But this cell that we just looked at, it makes about 20,000 connections with other cells. In fact, it looks so pretty because it's flat. That's why these branches don't overlap that much and create this beautiful pattern, because it's flat. It's not three-dimensional. I mean, it is, but it's in a plane. And then there are lots of fibers that are coming perpendicular to this structure, and this cell makes about 20,000 connections. That's where the information is coming to the cell. And then it does something. So it listens to 20,000 voices at the same time. And that's what neural cells do. They connect to each other. Why do they connect? Because they can send information to each other. They can talk to each other because there is this special thing called action potentials, and we'll talk about that in about like 2 weeks. That will be the second topic in the class. They usually, like in fancy videos, they're usually presented as sparks or splashes of light. They're not actually splashes of light, they're not actually sparks, but some electricity is involved, and that's a good metaphor. And the words that people usually use are spike or fire, but essentially what happens is that something happens to the cell, something travels along these long parts of the cell, and cells can talk to each other because of that. Neural cells can talk to each other. So they make lots of connections because they use these connections to exchange information with each other. All right? Good. So let's now do this exercise. Let's talk a little bit more about neurons. Let's look at what they're made of. Do they have some parts that have some names? And let's do this exercise. So draw a neuron. If you have a piece of paper, like pause the video and try to sketch a neuron. Or if you don't have paper in your house, then I don't know, pause the video and imagine what you would have drawn if you had paper. So pause the video, do that, and then we'll talk. Done? Okay, good. let's see. What did you draw? I don't know. But many people, as it turns out, draw something like that. It's just a very common thing, like that. It's a very common thing that people draw. It's a textbook neuron. The problem with it is that it doesn't exist. So this picture is funny because it has a life of its own at this point, and especially if you have drawn these, you know, beads, like, oh, I was trying to draw on the board. Yeah. So if you drew these little beads, the funny thing is that they're actually different cells. These are not parts of this neuron. These are special cells like helper cells called glia, or in this case Schwann cells, that help the neuron to function. So if you drew those, you actually draw, like in this case, on this picture, we have 6 cells instead of 1. And the neuron itself, like with this part on this side and this part on this side, there are no neurons in the real brain that would look even remotely like that. Real neurons look kind of like that. They're spidery and wireframe, and they have these really thin and really long processes. And by processes here, I don't mean something happening. I mean these things that grow. This is a different meaning of this word, or different word with the same sound. Anyway, so they're spidery, and the nucleus and the central part that's so prominent here in the picture is actually barely visible on these realistic pictures. So this textbook neuron was at some point, there was an interesting investigation to the history of this picture. So somebody put it in a textbook long ago. I think it was either late 19th century or early 20th century, and then some other person was making a textbook and like copied this picture, and then it just kept reproducing, even though it doesn't look like a real neuron. And I mean, yeah, obviously drawing a real neuron is not a pleasant thing because they're so chaotic. I mean, it's pleasant, but in a different way, in an artistic way, maybe. So people usually work with simpler diagrams of a neuron. But so usually when in actual science, when people need to simplify things, they often go further, even further on the way of simplification, have something like that, have a neuron. So people sometimes think of neurons as just units that receive some information, do something with it, and send it further. So in this case, a neuron just becomes this point, this node, this like blob that just receives something and sends something further. All right? So let's look at some realistic neurons, slightly more realistic, from a textbook. As you can see, they come in different shapes, in different kinds, in different sizes, different varieties, and there is lots of diversity. And some of them look like giant trees, some of them look like these pathetic bulbs on sticks, and some of them are tiny and some of them are huge. Some of them are talking only across a few micrometers, but some of them go from like across your entire body. For example, if you move your hand, you have a neuron in your motor cortex that's sending an axon to the like middle of your back, and then there is a connection. But so it's a fairly long neuron. It travels across half of your body, or in case of like you moving your foot, it would be even slightly longer, right? It won't go to the foot, but it will go slightly lower in the spinal cord. So yeah, they may be tiny, they may be huge, but different parts of a neuron also have names. The central part, the cell body, is called the cell body, or another name is the soma. The soma is just Greek for body. I prefer the English version just because it's, why would you use a fancy word if you can use a simpler word? But soma is also quite used. So the center of the neuron, where the nucleus sits and where the proteins are synthesized, so most housekeeping activities are happening there, is called the cell body. All right, then this long part that grows from the cell body, like this long part that can travel across your entire body, for example, from your head to your spinal cord. It's called an axon. Axon is long. Sometimes it's short, but usually it's long. That's the one that travels, that actually takes the job on itself to grow through you to a different, like geographically different part. And those tree-like structures are called dendrites. And dendrite is a Greek word for a little tree, I guess. Dendros is a word for a tree, I think. And it actually comes from the same root, in the European root. So tree and dendrite, this third combination of words, of sounds. It's actually almost the same word. All right? And then sometimes there are dendrites that are closer to the body, and then they're called proximal dendrites, like these guys are proximal dendrites. And those dendrites that are further may be called like distal dendrites, because they're the distance, right? And so if you look at this variety, you can figure out that depending on what people do, they may be interesting. Oh, I thought, wow. Okay. They may be interested in either details of the shape or more common patterns and the common logic. And people actually asked, so that's the funny part from Twitter, people asked some undergraduates and graduate students in neuroscience and professors to draw a neuron. As you can see, undergraduates typically draw this classic neuron that doesn't exist just because textbooks are full of them, which is weird. And then graduate students start to transition into different shapes, and professors basically fall into two types. Those who draw like realistic neurons with strange morphologies, and those who go for a block diagram, because that's two main approaches. If you care about the shape, if you work at this tiny microscopic level, if you care about like how different parts of the neuron work, then you would be interested in its shape, in this chaotic detail. While if you work with circuits or brain regions, then for you neurons are just thingies that connect to each other and send information to each other according to some logic. All right? Good. So now the final part is the plan for this course, really briefly. So we'll start with some terminology. There will be a video on terminology, and then we'll talk about ions in the cell and the voltages and how cells work. And this is the part that's a little bit more like nuts and bolts, and the only part where we'll touch a little bit upon chemistry and physics, but like bare minimum of that, just to understand where it comes from, because it's needed in order to understand action potentials and how neurons talk to each other. And then once we have action potentials, we'll add a little bit about animal behavior to that. And by comparing animal behavior and what we know about neurons, what neurons can do, we can actually start to understand some small circuits that underlie certain behaviors. So how from combining a few neurons together, you can make animals do things. And then we'll add synapses. This is how neurons talk to each other, and neurotransmitters, all the types of chemicals that are in the brain. And it will allow us to talk about more fancy circuits that create fancier behaviors. And from there we go into the world of sensation, so sensory systems, how you feel, how you perceive the world, and animals, how animals perceive the world. We'll talk about like smell and taste, but mostly we'll pay attention to hearing. So we'll talk about the ear and how ear works and how information from the ear is processed in the brain. And we'll talk about music a little bit. And then about vision, about the eye, because the eye is fancy, and about how information from the eye is processed in the brain, because it's also fancy. And we'll talk about visual illusions, because visual illusions are a great way to kind of deconstruct different aspects of how our brain process visual information from the eye. Then we'll talk about different brains and brain morphology and different parts of the brain with their names and how to study them and how to figure out what part of the brain does what. We'll talk a little bit about motion and how we control our bodies and our muscles, and then we'll talk about memory briefly, brain development briefly, and different parts of the cortex, because cortex is this human thing. Like, yeah, we'll talk about that. And we'll talk about parts of the cortex that are most kind of philosophically weird, like those that make us behave in uniquely human ways. And a little bit about perception, not a little bit about cognitive science, like a little bit will wade into these waters of how our minds are organized generally, and we'll talk about consciousness a little bit at the end. So that's the main plan, that's the main overview. Some topics may be required, some topics may be kind of tangential, so yeah, we'll figure it out. It's a lot, but we can do it, and it will be fun. Yay, see you later.